Hello. Welcome, everybody. Looks like it's time to get started here. If you're having a hard time finding a seat, there are still some seats up front, some more on this side over here. Still can't find a chair, feel free to grab one from one of the tables and pull it up. Might as well get as close as you can. But yeah, welcome everyone to this evening's lecture, Engaging the Sages of Our Age, Ancient Wisdom as a Guide for Modern Gurus. We're glad you're here and hope today's teaching serves you well. My name is Micah Hunter. I am a student here at South Dakota State University in my junior year, and I am with Equip here. This evening's lecture has been organized by Equip Campus Ministries, and we are happy to have both Crew and the Navigators sponsoring and partnering together with us as we discuss this timely issue. If you're interested in knowing a little bit more about any of these Christian groups, please ask around or grab a flyer from the tables. There are various meetings all throughout the week, Wednesday nights, Tuesday nights, Thursday nights as well as a sundry Bible studies and activities. Consider checking them all out. Highly recommend it. Our presenter will also be saying something about Bethlehem College and Seminary, but please feel free to check out his information at the table up front as well. So this evening's lecture is timely and relevant as Christians and people of many different convictions all over the world find themselves able to avail themselves of incredibly diverse, influential, and in some cases wise and helpful teachers and influential voices. Today's sages, such as Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Haidt, and others, all promise a way to navigate in uncertainty and anxiety of our cultural moment. They offer rules for life, exercises for emotional stability, strategies for making the right decision, from anywhere from relationships down to business. So how should Christians evaluate today's sages? In his day, Augustine commends plundering pagan philosophies to build up the church. Using Augustine's wisdom, we'll then consider ways to wisely plunder and carefully critique the sages of our age. This is the topic before us this evening, and we are eager to consider it together. After the lecture tonight, we encourage you to stick around for a time of Q&A, which we will do in two ways. First of all, we're going to have a couple people walking around with a mic, so you can just raise your hand then, and they'll bring you a mic over for you to answer your question. And you also see you have a QR code on your chair. If you go ahead and scan that, that'll lead you to a Google form in which you can both ask your questions and vote on which questions you want Dr. Howard to answer. We'll have to get that later. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest lecturer. He attended Hillsdale College, where he graduated with a bachelor's degree in history. He and his wife, Betsy, then spent 2 years together teaching at a classical Christian school in Cincinnati, Ohio. In 2012, they then moved to Minneapolis to attend Bethlehem Seminary, where Zach completed his Master's of Divinity in 2016, later a Master's of Art in 2019 at St. Thomas University, a PhD at Durham University in Durham, England in 2024, and he currently serves at Bethlehem College and Seminary as the Academic Dean and Assistant Professor of Theology and Humanities. Would you please welcome Dr. Zach Howard?
Yeah, thanks, Micah. Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to be with you. Thanks for the warm welcome. Thanks for the introduction, Micah. I'm glad to be here and eager to talk with you about tonight's topic. Are we all good to go in the back? Okay, great. And so let's just dive in. When I was in your seat, when I was in college back in 2006, 2010, the new atheists dominated the public with their books like The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins and The End of Faith by Sam Harris and God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens. So these authors were public intellectuals making the case against religion in general and Christianity specifically. And for me, growing up in Berkeley, California, I often heard about Dawkins and Hitchens and would think, wow, these guys are really smart. They have a lot to say that I can learn from. I myself knew the Bible to be true, and I was confident that God was who he says he was, but they had things to say about science and psychology, about historical details and present trends that I had enough sense to think were likely true. So perhaps what they had to say about God was also true. And my hunch tonight is that some of you are in a similar place to where I was. Many of you know the God of the Bible, and you think and believe that God is who he says he is, but you're not sure what to think about those really smart guys, the ones who have a lot to say on YouTube or other social media channels. And so you're wondering if what they have to say is what we should believe as well. Or maybe you're in a slightly different place. Maybe you're not sure if you're a Christian and you hear someone like Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan, and you wonder maybe what they have to say about Christianity is right. Maybe what they're saying is true, and you're just not sure. Wherever you are, tonight, I want to help you think clearly. I'm especially interested, though, in speaking to you who are Christians here tonight, because I want to help you think Christianly about what Peterson and Rogan and Haidt have to say, because I myself needed help thinking about Dawkins and Hitchens and Sam Harris back in my college years. So whether you've just heard of these sages or you're dialed into their messages, I want to help you navigate a world full of sages offering wisdom. And I want to do so using the voice of an ancient Christian named Augustine. And I think he offers us as Christians an excellent tool for wisely engaging the sages of our day. Augustine says that we should plunder the true insights from sages in order to build up the church, just like the Israelites plundered gold from the Egyptians to build up the tabernacle. But before I get to Augustine, let me see whether my hunch is right. So I have a few questions for all of you. I'd love you to raise your hands in response. So first of all, how many of you before tonight, or maybe before seeing the poster, had heard of Joe Rogan? How many of you guys have heard of Joe Rogan before? Okay, great. How many of you have watched Joe Rogan online in some capacity? Watched something he's done? Okay, how many have actually finished a full 3-hour episode of his all the way to the end? Okay, that's kind of what I've expected. All right, great. All right, what about Peterson? How many of you had heard of him before tonight? Okay, helpful. How many of you have watched or listened to something online by Peterson? Interesting. And then how many of you actually have read one of his books? Okay, great. All right, last, how many of you heard of Jonathan Haidt before tonight? Oh, very interesting. Okay, it's helpful. And then YouTube, online, and I'm assuming no books. Okay, very interesting. All right, that's great, very helpful. All right, so let me explain where we're headed tonight. Here's where we're going. First, I want to just define what I mean by sage, and then introduce those three guys that we just were asking about. Then I'm going to go on and explain Augustine's analogy of plundering Egyptians and think about how that makes sense for us today in the modern world. And then last, I want to engage Jordan Peterson specifically and the wisdom that he offers. So first of all, what do I mean by a sage? Sages speak persuasively to our problems. They can name the deepest challenges that we face and can offer a way through them and beyond them. In other words, a sage speaks wisdom, wisdom that describes where we are and also discerns where we should head to and how to get there. In the ancient world, a sage was a philosopher, not the kind of armchair philosopher who just sits there and thinks about big problems. No, a philosopher was mainly the one who thought deeply and then acted intentionally. For a time in the ancient world, the Greco-Roman world, philosophers were often the people you would go to get help, not for physical diseases, but for diseases of the soul. You would go to them to be a guide for your soul, to navigate both trials and disappointments, as well as joys and triumphs. And therefore, in many ways, I think today we can think about psychologists like ancient philosophers. Psychologists are offering a way to guide our souls, a way to live. And I'm going to try to illustrate who these sages are today by naming the three folks and saying more about them. And then I'm going to introduce the key ideas of both Peterson and Haidt, and then finally, given our time constraints, just focus on Peterson. So who are these sages? First of all, Joe Rogan started as a stand-up comedian, mixed martial arts fanatic, and he's been a fantastically successful podcaster. He also, his influence therefore comes primarily through his podcasting. And in many ways, I think people connect with him because he authentically responds to those that he is interviewing. He doesn't seem to have a script. And one of the reasons I included Rogan as someone worth engaging is because he offers and commends ancient Stoic philosophers like Marcus Aurelius as a model for living in the modern world. So in other words, he's trying to retrieve and commend for today ancient philosophy for living in this moment. And the overlap really between these three guys that I'm talking about tonight, they're all commending the same thing. They're all in many ways commending a virtuous approach to life in the same way that Stoic philosophers would have back in the ancient world. Jonathan Haidt, the second guy, social psychologist at New York University School of Business. And social psychologist means that he's evaluating psychological trends in society. And you can see that especially in his books. He recently wrote first The Coddling of the American Mind, and that one was evaluating how many people on college campuses like and why. So you guys were his lab rats, or at least the generation before you, about 10 years ago. And his second book, or the most recent one, The Anxious Generation, goes deeper into that same question about how technology is shaping the way we live. And you can see in his subtitle, his claim there that there's this great rewiring happening through the use of technology causing greater mental illness. And some of you probably are very aware of what he's getting at. He's about to publish a book called The Life After Babel. And it's, I think, valuable to just recognize here, he's drawing from a biblical metaphor, right? The Tower of Babel. All of three of them do it, but especially Haidt and Peterson. Peterson, like Haidt, is also a psychologist, just a clinical psychologist, which means he's the one sitting down with people, listening to them, helping them work through whatever issues they're bringing. But in the last 8 years or so, he's also become a renowned public speaker. He's written 2 books on rules for life. 12 Rules for Life was his first one, and his second one was Beyond Order. And both of them offer clear, actionable advice about how to live based on ancient wisdom combined with modern psychology. His most recent book just came out this last November. It's called We Who Wrestle with God, which I'll have a few more things to say about, but he's essentially arguing there that the Bible offers essential wisdom for navigating life. Now, you may be asking, who cares about these guys? Why are they so influential? What are they saying that's compelling to so many people? And it is compelling to many people. Almost all of you raised your hand for Rogan, most of you for Peterson, a lot fewer for Haidt. Might be because he's an East Coaster. I'm not sure. I would be interested in the Q&A if you guys have some hypotheses about why that'd be the case. So why are they influential? I would suggest it's because our age, our day is desperate for wisdom. We have so much information out there, an endless amount, right? But we, in many ways, because of the amount of information available to us, are desperate to make wise choices, to be able to sift through the plethora, the seemingly endless amount of information out there to make wise decisions about life. And we recognize, right, there's so many problems in our world. Both my generation and yours are asking, how do I do something that really matters? How can I find meaning when so many people are addicted to their social media or addicted to pornography or drugs? Or maybe you're one of the ones who's addicted and you're asking, why can't I stop? Why can't I choose to do something different, something better? Is there a better life available for me? And if so, how do I find it? Both Peterson and Haidt especially recognize this crisis of meaning today. The secular ideologies of the past few centuries have proven to be incapable of answering many of the deepest human questions that we must address in order to live a meaningful life. Peterson and Haidt tell a compelling story about why secular ideologies don't adequately address our problems, and they're providing answers in a way that is compelling to so many modern secular people. That's okay. But it's not just that they recognize that there's a problem. They offer a compelling solution. I think Peterson and Haidt and Rogan appeal to a wide audience today because they are offering Stoic wisdom at the end of an Epicurean age, an end of an age of pleasure seeking. Each of them call people to practice virtue and to take responsibility for their lives. If you take responsibility, or as Peterson says, if you hoist the burden of the world on your shoulders, then you'll be able to live a good life. Although Peterson is often labeled more as a conservative and Jonathan Haidt more as a classical liberal, they both elevate this Stoic, virtue-focused outlook on life. And I think it appeals to a broad cross-section of people from a variety of backgrounds. And their call to take responsibility and pursue a life of virtue resonates in an age where we hear so much of you do you, or YOLO, you only live once, or you can be whatever you want to be, just follow your dreams. And people have recognized that that's proven hollow in so many ways. Yet more importantly than this attractiveness to their message, I think is the fact that they offer so many insights about how virtue actually works and what we're actually like as humans. And those insights are true. They're saying true things. So let me just introduce you to a few of them, if you've not heard these. Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, identifies 3 lies that a broad swath of our culture believes. The first is the lie of fragility. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker. This is the opposite of how humans work. Humans are, in fact, anti-fragile, meaning when we encounter challenging things, we actually get stronger. Think about your immune systems. When your immune system encounters a foreign pathogen, a disease, when it defeats that, you're stronger afterwards. Humans are like that. We're not porcelain dolls. So his point is that this lie about fragility misleads so many people, and we need to recognize that we are, in fact, anti-fragile. Or another one, the lie of emotional reasoning or always trust your feelings. Haidt says we can't do that, right? Our feelings are not always trustworthy. You must instead test your feelings and determine if they're correct. And he, in fact, recommends CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, to do that. His psychological background coming into play. Or third, the lie of us versus them, which is that life is a battle between good people and evil people. That's not how it works, because as one Christian says, the line between good and evil runs through the middle of every human heart. There is no us versus them. These lies that Haidt introduces and exposes in our culture have been believed by so many to their great detriment. And Haidt's work, by exposing the destructive consequences of these ideas, helps people live well. And he's doing so from a position at elite university in New York and from his social psychological background. And so he's credible for that reason. Consider Peterson. We'll talk more about him, but just a quick introduction. I'd say one of his main messages is that you should take responsibility for yourself, right? Proper responsibility. And this is tied to his idea of subsidiary identity, fancy phrase, but basically just means that every individual participates in the wider collective kind of through concentric circles. So you have the individual, and moving out from there to the family, neighborhood, town, state, nation, world, right? And your responsibility is first to the circles closest in. That basic insight helps people, especially young people, learn to take responsibility for themselves first. Then you can be capable of taking responsibility for others. So his famous exhortation is clean your room, right? If you can't clean your room, why are you critiquing people on social media? You need to learn to manage yourself before you can manage others. So we move out from the individual beyond. And his rules for life, again, offer some very almost obvious exhortations or rules, like stand up straight with your shoulders back, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world, or be precise in your speech, or be grateful in spite of your suffering. So I want to focus especially on Peterson tonight because he may be the most compelling to a group of young Christians who I'm primarily interested in talking about, but I'm glad you're here if you're not a Christian and would welcome your questions afterward. But Peterson talks about God and the Bible a lot. He calls you to live a life of responsibility in order to find meaning. He defends objective truth and dismantles the secular ideologies of our day. And he exudes confidence as he does so. He offers a coherent way to live, which so many people have found compelling. So, what should we as Christians think about a modern sage like Jordan Peterson? Well, we might be tempted to accept everything he says, given the compelling insights that he has. Or we might be tempted to reject what he says because he's not a Christian. But this is, in fact, a false choice. We should neither wholly accept nor entirely reject what Peterson or other sages like Haidt or Rogan have to offer. We need to engage their ideas as men capable of seeing true things about the world. But how do we do that well? How do we wisely and Christianly engage such sages without compromising our Christian commitments or allowing ourselves to be led astray by false ideas? Well, I think, as I said already, Augustine offers a model for doing that. Here's where I want to bring him in. One of the reasons that I think we can and should learn from Augustine is because the wisdom that Haidt and Peterson and Rogan are offering is in many ways ancient wisdom. The origins of cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, Haidt points out, is from Stoicism, right? And Stoicism was at its height in Augustine's day. So if any Christian knows Stoicism well, it would be Augustine. Now, Augustine has a marvelous story, and I would encourage you, if you haven't, to read his book, Confessions, where he tells that story. But we don't have time to tell it tonight, but just briefly, Augustine was a prodigal, right? He ran from his Christian faith in his youth, only to come back as a 30-year-old and be quite dramatically converted to faith. And then became a pastor and served for 40 years, during which he wrote some amazing books. Two of them I'll mention that were perhaps most influential: Confessions and City of God. So I'm drawing from those works, as well as another one called Teaching Christian Doctrine, in what I have to say from Augustine. And what he's saying is that, what I really want to focus on is that Christians should plunder the truth from unbelievers like the Israelites plundered gold from the Egyptians. So what does he mean? Well, let me explain the analogy. Augustine is using an analogy from the book of Exodus. Here are the Egyptians. Some of you might be thinking, oh yeah, Exodus. To explain how Christians today should approach true things they learn from non-Christians. So gold is like truth, the Egyptians are like unbelievers, and the Israelites are like Christians. Now, if you remember the story of Exodus, God, right, promises to Moses that he will lead the people of Israel out of captivity in Egypt into the promised land. And the people, after witnessing God defeat his enemies through the 10 plagues and then bring them miraculously through the Red Sea, they then meet Yahweh in chapter 19 at Mount Sinai. And in the rest of the book, Moses receives the 10 commandments, and the people begin building the tabernacle, which is the place where God meets his people. It's a familiar story to many of you, but there's a surprising subplot to that story. And it's a subplot about Israelites, the captives, plundering their captors, the Egyptians, when they leave. And I want you to see the subplot so you can understand and use Augustine's analogy. So there's a lot of text up there. I'll walk us through it, okay? Let me give us the key parts of the subplot. First, Yahweh actually promises and commands the plundering. When he encounters Moses at the burning bush, it's where he promises to Moses that the Israelites will plunder the Egyptians. And we're not really sure what that's going to mean. But then Yahweh fulfills his promise in Exodus 12 when they are leaving after the 10th plague. They're leaving Egypt, and the Egyptians, it says that they found favor in the Egyptians' eyes, and they're just like, here's our gold, here's our silver, here's our clothing, go, right? And they send them off. And in many ways, it's like the conquerors by the 10 plagues are plundering what they've won in their conquest. Now, the people are to plunder in order to build, or they're supposed to build the tabernacle, but they end up building instead a golden calf in chapter 32. So while Moses is up on the mountain, right, he's up there for a long time, 40 days. And there's like, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to worship? So they asked Aaron, Moses' brother, you remember this? Hey, make us an idol like we had back in Egypt that we can worship. And you can imagine that, some of the gold that they plundered was actually in the form of the idols that the Egyptians worshipped. Maybe a calf, for example. And Moses comes down off the mountain, sees the people worshiping this golden calf, confronts Aaron, and is like, what happened? And he's like, people gave me the gold. I threw it in the fire, and out popped this golden calf. Like, really, Aaron? Come on. But Moses makes them smash that idol, grind it into dust, and then drink it. A lot of different ideas about why he did that. I think at the very least, it's to remind them that they were worshiping something that can be destroyed, right? And there's some other implications if you think about how that processes through your body, right? They were worshiping that, right? It's a humiliation, exposing their idolatry. The amazing part of the story is that God reveals himself afresh and renews the covenant despite their disobedience, despite their utter lack of respect and love for Yahweh. He renews his covenant and says, I am the Lord, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. And soon after this, Yahweh calls the people again to build the tabernacle, requests contributions of gold and silver, gems, and all sorts of things that they plundered from the Egyptians to build up the tabernacle where he will meet them. And he does that by inspiring certain men to be the ones to build. So everyone contributes in some way, right? Some give of the gold they plunder, silver, some build. There's other things like spinning yarn and skinning animals and using the hides to build the tabernacle. So I hope you're getting some sense now about how Augustine might be thinking about this analogy and the force of this analogy when we think about the way it can be used to plunder people today. So I want to unpack that a little bit further. Just think about, okay, that's the analogy. Now, what does it mean? Okay. God commands plundering, which means we should engage non-Christian thinkers. We're thinking about what Augustine's analogy means here. Plundering has a positive purpose, namely to build the house of God. We plunder in order to build up the church. But of course, plundering is dangerous. Egyptian gold is associated with Egyptian idolatry. And the golden calf episode shows the danger of syncretism, which is blending together Christian worship with the means or even worship of idolatry, of pagan worship. The Apostle Paul asks in 1 Corinthians, what agreement has the temple of God with idols? And the implied answer is none. They should not be brought together, right? So for plundering to happen, we must have spirit-inspired wisdom, right? We need also wise leaders to follow. Just like God inspires leaders of the Israelites to build the tabernacle, so too God today raises up leaders in his church to disciple and guide Christians in wisely engaging the world. Also, fifth here, the purpose of plundering is to build the house of God. Egyptian plunder, therefore, must be dismantled in order to be repurposed. Some gold needs to be melted down before it can be used, meaning skewed visions of reality where nuggets of truth might exist need to be removed in order for that insight to be rightly used. Some jewels have to be removed from their setting in order to be put in the temple well. We need to bring over the insights accurately in order to use them in a new context. One other thing that's not mentioned in Exodus, but is later mentioned, is the importance of time. In the story of Leviticus, you had to set aside certain time for purification to happen. I think that's probably a good word for us today when thinking about contemporary sages. There might be wisdom in being a little patient before you try to plunder current sages. So here's the point. Here's the point of Augustine's analogy. Oh, one more thing. when we fail to disentangle, we don't plunder well, God is merciful and gracious, just like he was to the people of Israel in Exodus. So the point of Augustine's analogy, Christians should not be afraid when non-Christians say true things about the world, about reality, because all truth is God's truth. Wherever it's found, whoever says it, all truth is God's truth. So just like God created actual gold that the Egyptians mined from the earth and fashioned into idols, so too God is a source of truth behind the wisdom of every sage, behind Peterson, behind Haidt, behind Rogan. And just as the Israelites can rightly use Egyptian gold when properly melted down and refashioned to build the tabernacle to worship God, so too Christians today can lay claim to that truth presented by modern sages to build up the house of God, even to preach the gospel, if they wisely disentangle it from false systems. So I think the story of Exodus suggests that Christians should engage non-Christian thinkers like Peterson or Haidt or Rogan to take the truth that is rightfully God's. And when that truth, and when they acquire that truth, use it to build up the church. So wisdom from Peterson, Haidt, and others can be a means for advancing the kingdom of God. But the key thing to remember, the key thing we cannot forget, is that we must melt down that gold to build the house of God. We must remove the gems from their idolatrous setting before we can use them in worshiping God. So hopefully I've at least persuaded you enough to think that's plausible. Now let's consider what that might look like. So what might it look like with, say, Jordan Peterson to plunder today? As I said in the beginning, my goal in engaging Peterson's ideas is to help you think Christianly about them. So with Augustine's framework in place, we're going to look at the core of Peterson's message. So recently, Peterson spoke at a conference called the ARC Conference, and many people are saying that's the best distillation of his ideas. Which is helpful because his most recent book was 500 pages long. So a 30-minute speech, that's helpful. Many who know Peterson think that this speech offered the essential core of his message, which is this: we can find meaning through responsibility. We can find meaning through responsibility. When we have learned to lead ourselves wisely, we can sacrificially take on responsibility for those around us in increasing circles so that we can tilt the world away from hell and towards heaven. That's his promise in this speech. That's what we're after. If we do this, if we hoist the burden of the world on our shoulders and trudge up the hill towards heaven, we will find true meaning. Our lives will be worth it. It will really matter. That's his message. And it's been inspiring to many. So, Peterson, I'll walk through his speech in brief. Cliff Notes version. Peterson begins his speech with a simple yet profound story. It's a story of teaching his son to clean his room. And now this is vintage Peterson. If we can learn to take responsibility for the most basic things around us, then that will be a small yet significant step towards heaven. So how does that happen? Well, he explains that for his 2-year-old son, it looks like learning to put his teddy bear in its proper place on the shelf. That's it. Son, see that teddy bear? Go get that teddy bear. He's excited about that, right? He knows what a teddy bear is. Runs over, grabs it. See that spot on the shelf over there? Go put it there. And if you do that repeatedly, he says, you can create 100 micro routines like that. You can teach him to clean his room, and he knows how to do that. And that's how we build ourselves. And And that's a little vision. It's a micro vision, he says. The first vision is what the room would look like if the teddy bear was put in its proper place. It's not a glorious macro vision of how to unite heaven to earth, but it's a proximal beginning of exactly that process. So we scaffold ourselves upward from the finite to the infinite. And it's the entire scaffold that constitutes our identity. Do you hear what he's saying there? It's right there. If the child takes responsibility to put that teddy bear on the shelf where it belongs, that begins the process of finding meaning, building his very identity through responsibility. Peterson calls this subsidiarity, building outward and upward from those things that are close to you to those that are furthest away. And a subsidiary structure like that is the concentric circles of responsibility that form our very identity and give us meaning in life. So meaning through responsibility for Peterson, though, it looks like sacrificing lower things for higher things, base pleasure for greater pleasures. We recognize, of course, that there is a hierarchy of worth to things around us. Some things are simply better than others. Some things in this world have more value than others. If we learn how to recognize that, and if we set ourselves goals that are aimed at those higher things and move us past our selfish desires, then we'll find far greater satisfaction. We know this. Peterson explains this by pointing actually to Abraham in the book of Genesis, choosing to answer the call of God to leave the comfort of his homeland, to strike out on this grand adventure of his lifetime and discover something greater. And Peterson calls this a good bargain because humans are built not merely for satiating our desires, right? Just seeking little pleasures, like the dopamine hits from the next video on your feed, but we're made for a grand adventure. We're made for something greater. We're made for something that will move us beyond ourselves, something that forces us to wrestle with what it means to be noble and courageous. And it's in facing the suffering and trials that inevitably come along with that we find meaning in life. Here's what Peterson says. He says, if you lived your life completely, maybe it would justify itself, right? And where would you find the meaning that justifies the suffering in life? And the answer to that is in the burden of responsibility, because the burden of responsibility isn't a burden. It's the greatest opportunity you could possibly have. And you know perfectly well when you're trying to decide if your own life is worth having, that if someone comes up to you even once and says, you know, what you did for me there, it really mattered. You see that sacrificial approach to life of giving up lower pleasures for greater goods? That's how we find meaning through responsibility. We do this for those first closest around us. Right now, for many of you, that's probably roommates and classmates. One day, it may be in marriage and in parenting, or as leaders in your community. His message is if we find or take responsibility for ourselves, if we really find meaning in sacrificing for others in a way that aims beyond our selfish desires, we can tilt the world away from hell towards heaven. Now, notice how Peterson says that there. His climactic statements in this speech offer a vision of what we must do as individuals and collectively to make life worth living, to tilt the world towards heaven. Listen, one final quote from him. If we hoist the burden of the world on our shoulders and operate collectively in this harmonious manner, we can continue to struggle uphill toward the city of God. And that's the truth. That's the truth. It's not some superstition. It's not some primitive defense against death anxiety. It's not the opiate of the people. It's the call of divine responsibility. Peterson really believes this. This isn't just a psychological tool, which I think why it's compelling to so many people. And there is gold to plunder there. I think a lot of what he's saying is true. For example, the idea of taking responsibility or subsidiarity, that's in the Bible. Take what Paul says to Timothy in 1 Timothy 5. But if anyone does not provide for his own relatives, and especially for the members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. That's pretty strong, Paul. Or consider what Paul tells the Ephesians. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. I think this is why Peterson's message has really caught the attention of so many Christians. It's why Christians and those close to Christianity are asking, is he right? Is what he's saying true? And as Christians, we need to be able to engage Peterson and others with more than just a naive yes or no. And the tool that Augustine offers us is, I think, a humble yet careful way to glean wisdom for building up the household of God. But as I've said, we need to be discerning when we do that. We need to melt down the gold before we try to bolt it onto the house of God. And for Christians today, that is especially complicated with someone like Peterson because of how his message actually draws from the Bible and from Christian wisdom. I mean, even heard in some of the things I read from him, he's using biblical examples and imagery. And we must recognize that despite that, he lacks something essential. He lacks, in fact, the gospel, namely that God has loved us first. So I think to plunder Peterson well, we need to recognize first that Jordan Peterson needs the gospel, and so do we. Peterson gives rules for life, but no hope for when you aren't enough to follow those rules. He offers inspiring words for the person wanting to live for something outside themselves, but he cannot offer the good news of the gospel. At the end of the day, the hope Peterson offers is hope in himself. We have to be the ones who hoist the world on our shoulders and trudge up towards heaven. But that's not heaven, that's hell. Sooner or later, we will discover that we just can't. We'll realize that we're more like the ancient Greek character Sisyphus, who was condemned to push up the boulder to the top of the hill, only to have it fall back down and have to do it again the next day for all of eternity. That's not heaven, that's hell. Beneath our desires for pleasure and our desires for meaning is the desire to be loved. And Jesus offers far better news than anything Peterson can give. The good news is that we don't have to carry the world on our shoulders. We're not Atlas holding up the world, right? We don't have to do that because heaven has come down to us. The Son of God became man so that men by grace might become like God. God made us to be in relationship with him. And we rejected that. We turned from him like the prodigal son and ran away into a far country. But our Heavenly Father, like the prodigal son's father, says, come home. You're welcome back. Repent and return to me. You don't need to do anything to do that. You don't need to bring anything. You don't need to clean yourself up first, because God has all that we need. And when we receive that good news, when we receive it, the gospel, when by faith we repent and receive Christ's forgiveness, it is only then that we can begin to live according to God's law and by the power of his Spirit obey it. If we try to save ourselves, if we try to hoist the world on our shoulders and trudge up towards heaven, we will only crush ourselves. We're creatures incapable of carrying the world. But because Christ came down, hoisted all of the world's sin and shame, burdens and guilt on his shoulders, and then died so that we might live, we can now live in freedom. And then only in that freedom that we have can we follow any rules with any success. And even in following those rules, we don't cease to need the gift of God's grace for us. The same grace by which we are justified in God's eyes is the grace by which we are transformed into his image. We are saved from our past, present, and future sins by grace so that we can walk in a manner worthy of Christ. When the psalmist says in Psalm 24, who can ascend to the hill of the Lord? Like, who can go up there? How can we get up there? And the answer is, he who has clean hands and a pure heart, he who does not lift his soul to what is false. We can't ascend that hill because we are not clean. We can't clean ourselves. Remember the prophet Isaiah, when he sees that hill, when he sees God on his throne, he says, woe is me. I am a man of unclean lips, right? He recognizes that he cannot make himself clean. The only reason we can ascend that hill is because Jesus ascends for us. He goes outside of Jerusalem on that dark Friday so that 3 days later, when he rises from the dead, we can ascend by faith in his conquest of sin and death and Satan with him up to the mountaintop with God. And that's the happy end of every Christian story, our story. The grace-empowered ascent up to heaven. And it's an ascent to God the Father by the power of the Holy Spirit because of Christ's descent to death, resurrection, and ascent to heaven, where he now reigns in power over all things. This Christ, this Jesus, the God-man, is real, and only he can save you. Now, I'm guessing that some of you may wonder, maybe especially those who do appreciate Peterson, read or listened or watched him, you may be asking, why doesn't Peterson accept the gospel? Especially since he knows the Bible so well. He just wrote a 500-page book on it. And you're right. He does know the biblical stories very well. Perhaps better than most of us in the room. And you probably notice that he's constantly using biblical imagery. Peterson accepts the Bible as something worth engaging and drawing from. That's why he writes 500 pages on it. So why doesn't he accept the Bible's climactic message that Jesus came to seek and save the lost? Well, I hope he's on the road to believing and trusting in Jesus rather than himself for salvation. And there's many Christians who are praying for that to happen. But I think one of the main barriers for why it's not happened yet, why he hasn't received the gospel, is his approach to the Bible. And this is important for us to recognize. Peterson reads the Bible as a self-help manual, as a collection of stories that reveal human consciousness in deep and profound ways. And that those ways, if we discover them, can guide us in living well. But Peterson is confused about the genre of the Bible, what kind of book it is. As Christians, we know the Bible is not a collection of holy narratives about how to be a good person or how to embrace the heroic instinct from learning from Abraham or David or Jesus. The Bible is God talking to us. It's a story of what God has done, is doing, and will do to save his people. So Jordan Peterson has helped so many people grapple with their identity and strive towards finding meaning in their suffering and trials. And as Christians, we should recognize that and learn from him by plundering what he has to say. That is what is true about what he says. And we should recognize, even as we do that, that he needs someone to save him. He cannot point anyone else to where they can find their own true salvation until he recognizes that. So we should plunder these sorts of things from Peterson. His critiques of secular ideologies, his straightforward, actionable advice, the concept of subsidiarity. I'm happy to talk more about any of those in Q&A. Lots more to say about them. And yet, I think we can only do that successfully if we rightly remove those from his man-centered approach to meaning, his man-centered approach to how we are saved. So let me conclude with a few principles for plundering as you go forward. If you're to do it well, the goal of your plundering is what matters most. And that goal I've suggested, Augustine suggests, is to build up the church, to advance the gospel. That must guide what we plunder and how we plunder. Not everything is worth plundering. In the internet age, there is a lot of stuff that's not worth plundering, right? Almost anyone can start a YouTube page and just start saying things and get people following them. You can gain an audience very quickly. Therefore, we must exercise discernment about who we give our attention to. Not every person on YouTube is worth listening to, or Instagram, or X, or any other social media platform. Augustine's encouragement to plunder Egyptians is not a free pass or an excuse to take in anything that's out there. So whenever we engage non-Christian thinkers, we must do so with the aim of learning from them so that we can build up the church. But second, I think one other principle to follow is that the more practical the advice, the easier it is to plunder. It's easier to plunder a cooking book than a book of ancient philosophy, right? It's also true that the usefulness of those recipes for building up the church will likely be far less than the usefulness of, say, Aristotle's philosophical distinction between act and potency, which has been a very useful distinction for theology. The more practical and prudent the advice, the easier it is to plunder. But some Christians should engage more than just the practical stuff. And that's why I think the third one is very important to keep in mind too. And that is that greater maturity means greater capacity to plunder well. So if you're young in the faith, focus on knowing your Bible and getting discipled by someone older and wiser in the faith. And as you seek that discipleship, look for those who know how to plunder Egyptians well. Learn from them. As we saw in Exodus, plundering is dangerous. We must follow Augustine's advice to plunder with care. And one of the most important ways we can do that is by learning from those who have done it well already. In many ways, this is why Bethlehem College and Seminary exists, where I teach. We, in our college programs, teach the great books in light of the greatest book for the sake of the Great Commission. We study books like Aristotle's Metaphysics or Nicomachean Ethics in light of what the Bible says and use that to plunder Aristotle well for the sake of advancing the gospel, the Great Commission. That's what we're trying to do day in and day out as we train young men and women to wisely engage the world around them. And I'd encourage you, as you consider what would that look like, or if you're interested in thinking more deeply about these things, I'm just going to suggest 2 books. We've got free copies down there. Encourage you to come by, grab them. I'd love to talk with you. Both of them are by the chancellor of our school, John Piper. One's on lifelong learning, and one's on titled Astonished by God, coming to know who God is. So, in conclusion, in some sense, the influence of Egyptian gold is inevitable. You can't hide with your Bible in your closet and ignore the world. Jesus says that we must be in the world, but not of it. And Augustine's model of plundering Egyptians is one way we can wisely be in the world, but not buy into all that it offers. Wherever God has you and in whatever stage of life, let me encourage you to follow godly, wise models when you engage modern sages. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions in Q&A.
Well, thank you, Dr. Howard. Let's give him a round of applause again. Well, then, before we have a time of Q&A, we'd like for you to turn to your neighbors, either in pairs or groups of 3 and 4. Maybe take 5 minutes to discuss a main thought, maybe even these 3 principles on screen, I believe now, or any questions in response to what you just heard. And then after the 5 minutes, Dr. Howard will begin our time of Q&A. This is a good time now to scan that QR code and submit a question, or at the end of your small group time. And you'll see that you can either like or dislike the questions, as this will bring the most liked questions up to the top. We'll alternate a little bit between the online form of the questions and the live questions, which people will go around with mics. And if you tried to submit a question earlier and it didn't work, it should be open now. So at this time, you can go ahead and take 5 minutes to discuss. Thank you.
Okay. I got the thumbs up that we'll open it up for Q&A now. Happy to take any of your questions, serious or sarcastic. You can raise your hand, and someone, I think, with a mic will come and give it to you so you can ask your question live. Or I've got ones here on my phone, and I can read off those and answer those. I can start with one of these. First question, how can you know whether you're plundering too much from the Egyptians? Okay, so a question of extent. Yeah, good question. I think there's a few things to say there. First of all, there is a lot in the world to plunder, right? And I think, so no one person is going to be able to plunder very much. You should think about the number of different cultures, let alone books written over history. There's a lot to engage and plunder. So as far as knowing whether you've gone too far or you're doing it too much, I think that's best determined in community. Probably not by yourself going, have I gone too far? Like, one of the amazing things about the Christian life is we don't walk it by ourselves, right? We are designed to be in relationship. And yes, if you are a believer, you have the Holy Spirit dwelling in you. And yes, he can guide you in coming to know what is true, using the Bible especially. but also God has given the means of grace of his church and other individuals. So the first thing I would say is don't try to answer that question by yourself. The other thing I'd say is kind of some diagnostic questions you might ask if you're wondering, maybe I am getting just a bit too much of Peterson or Haidt or whomever else you might be listening to. Some diagnostic questions you might ask is, what is front and center in my mind most often? So you think like Colossians chapter 3 says, Paul says, set your mind on the things that are above, right? So it's this idea of setting your mind, bringing your attention to focus on, putting things in your mind that you recall regularly. In other words, memorizing the Bible. And just ask yourself, what comes to mind? What comes out of my mouth? What am I daydreaming about most? So I'd be thinking about that. And if it's, if you're testing what you're saying to other people and listening to like, hey, I've been hearing a lot of so-and-so from you, that would be a good way to know. Maybe it's a bit too much. I will say though, you're all in school. You're in particular classes that are forcing you to go deep in a particular topic. It's not wrong to go deep for a season with a particular thinker or with a particular system of thought, and to really try to glean as much as you can from it. So I think be attentive to the seasons of life. And there's only one book that should really endure in every season of life, right? That's the Bible. You might find someone like Peterson really helpful for a season, and that could fade away, and someone else might be particularly helpful. So another way to test it is like, how enduring is the particular my attention to Scripture? There's a few ideas. Happy to have a follow-up on that if you have one. And okay, I can keep reading, or feel free to ask questions by raising your hands. Got one over here. Oh, and I'd love to know your name. So give me your name first.
Okay. Well, my name is Jess.
Jess.
And so this is really loud. Okay. So my question is, so when you want to start plundering into these kind of topics, how can you best set your mind so that you don't necessarily fully believe, but just guard your heart and trying to center yourself in the word? Or like, what do you do?
Yeah, good question. I think it's helpful, first of all, to recognize that you're trying to plunder, right? I mean, one of the reasons I've given you this as a way of thinking is it sets your attitude to what you're engaging with. So I think that's really important to begin with. Because I mean, how many of us spend so much of our time just passively receiving and not actively considering what we're taking in? So that would be the first thing I would encourage you to think about. And then related to that, I find that I'm constantly getting other people's input. So whether it's people that I'm doing everyday life with, people in my small group, my wife, people I work with who are believers, getting their, like, man, so-and-so said this. What do you think about that? So kind of plundering together with other people will help a lot to do it wisely. Yeah, is that helpful? You want to follow up on that? Great. Okay, another one on here. Besides Stoicism, what other ancient philosophies that have come back should we be aware of? Okay, good question. So in the ancient world, kind of the big three, philosophies that were most dominant would be Stoicism, Epicureanism, which I mentioned, which is basically the idea that the way to be happy in life is to seek pleasure. Stoicism says the way to be happy in life is to seek virtue, right? If you cultivate in yourself wisdom and courage and justice and temperance, you will find happiness. That's the basic idea of Stoicism. Virtue is the means to happiness. For Epicureans, it was pleasure. Pleasure is what makes us happy. So do whatever you can to get as much pleasure as you can. And that was usually for Epicureans in a physical sense. Though, of course, it's mixed. Some people would say, appreciating beauty, for example, would be one way you can find pleasure. The third one, in terms of ancient philosophies, was Platonism. So you can hear in that maybe Plato's name. So the Greek philosopher Plato and his followers after him established a school of Platonism. And people like Augustine thought of those three, Platonism was the best. And at the core idea of Platonism is that there's one God, and we will be happy if we can come to know him and participate in his life. And that's actually, there's a lot that's true about that. And if there's anyone that Augustine plundered most, it was the Platonists. So that's the two other ones that have come back. I do think, though, that of those three, I suggested that I think Peterson and others are noticing that we're at the end of a pleasure-seeking age. And I think that's why Stoicism is having a greater comeback. I mean, you can go on Instagram and see, Epictetus, an ancient Stoic, showing up on people's Instagram feeds. People are quoting them all the time on X. Guys like Ryan Holiday, his whole livelihood is built on promoting Stoicism, and people like Rogan and others are having them on his podcast. So I think it's particularly appealing to young folks who are like, I want to make something in my life. And I think that might be through virtue, by taking responsibility and working hard on virtue. So there's a little background on some other philosophies. And there's a lot of good things to learn from them if we approach them from a Christian framework. Other questions? I come over here.
Yes, so
what's
my
your name?
name's Jimmy.
Jimmy?
You said that we're coming to an ender of like pleasure and that stuff and more into stoicism. I'm kind of curious with like technology and stuff like that of we're a high technological era and technology makes things easy, probably a high, easy focus on pleasure. So how is stoicism going to that, and how is maybe technology changing? Is it changing, or is there this fight between the technology and stoicism?
Yeah, if I'm understanding your question, what's the relationship between stoicism and technology? That's kind of what you're getting at?
But because I feel like technology really helps this idea of like seeking our pleasures and that stuff, especially because it's easy to find that, even when it comes to these podcasts of people just being able just to sit here and watch these. It's simple, it's easy to find wisdom, stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, technology is in many ways an accelerant. If you have certain desires, technology helps you get what you desire faster, easier, more conveniently. And in a lot of ways, that is at odds with seeking virtue, right? No great athlete became a great athlete by being like, I don't want to go work out today. I'm not going to go to practice, right? Virtue, just like athletic prowess, is built through hard work, and technology can help with that, but it often can be a hindrance because it makes it easier for us not to do the hard work. And I think a lot of people recognize that in their own lives and they want something more. So that's why there's just one thinker, for example, Cal Newport, not a Christian, but an excellent thinker when it comes to how we should appropriately use technology. And his basic point is that so often we end up getting used by technology rather than using technology for what we want. We think that we're getting what we want, but it turns out that what technology often gives us doesn't make us happy. I mean, how many of you, after, an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours on your phone on a Saturday scrolling, feel better about your life after that? Usually not, right? And now, of course, maybe it depends on the content. But if you're just going from one thing to the next, so that might be easy, but it's not actually making our life better. And Stoicism is saying, exactly, if you want to have a more fulfilling life, you have to do hard things, basically. So I think Stoicism is, in the modern world, this modern version of Stoicism, pushing back against how kind of the easy everywhere approach to technology, and saying that happiness is not found there, but in seeking virtue.
In your opinion, for like seeking Christ and that stuff, or
Mhm.
for sharing Christ, is this somewhat into a better era for that? Because people are like starting to find like there's no fulfillment thing. And maybe it's more about doing stuff, which I feel like you probably disagree. The Bible doesn't say that either. That it's not about, you don't find fulfillment doing stuff, you find fulfillment in Christ. But you think this transition is better for Christianity, somewhat not really a change, or maybe something more?
Yeah, to Jimmy, right? Yeah, just so if you guys couldn't hear Jimmy's question, follow-up question, is virtue seeking, does that align with Christianity? Is that better, or should we just be focusing on finding fulfillment in Christ? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Okay. I think that it's not, so pursuing a life of virtue is very much aligned with Christianity, but it's pursuing it without Christ that is not going to, in the end, be fulfilling. It's like, so two basic ideas of Christian doctrine. We are justified, meaning we are restored to a right relationship with God by faith. But because we've been restored to that relationship, then we can live in light of that, which would be sanctification. And I think what virtue without Jesus does is it tries to say, live righteously without being restored in your relationship to God, right? And that's what Peterson, for example, gets wrong. That's what Stoicism gets wrong. So yes, if you come to know Jesus, he says, follow me, right? Which means a life of obedience, a life of, yes, following rules, but rules that he's given to us for us to know him more. And that's where real meaning is found. So I think you're right that it can be misleading to just focus on virtue. We absolutely need to look to Christ, but it's not just, it's look to Christ and follow him. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, go on over.
Do you
What's your name?
Kelly,
Kelly, that's right. We met earlier. Yeah.
are there any current 21st century theologians or Christian philosophers who you think imitate Augustine well, and that might be further examples that to imitate or to learn from?
A lot. And I will, the reason why is because any good theologian becomes a good theologian by engaging those who are not Christians, right? That we can learn well from the Bible, but to be a thoughtful person who can speak about the things of God to a world that doesn't know him, you got to know what the world knows as well. And so, but I'll say just one that I think is someone who's doing this particularly well. And part of the reason I mention this person is because of where they're doing this. They're doing it in online YouTube space. His name is Gavin Ortland. Has a YouTube ministry called Truth Unites. And I think he models what I'm commending here really well. And he does that in a number of different areas, which is partly what makes him such a good model, because he can navigate questions about Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy and how that relates to Protestantism, but he also can answer questions like the problem of evil, which is, I think, a really important objection to God and his existence. That fact that we can see terrible things in the world. So yeah, that would be one. I'm happy to suggest others, but if you want to start with anybody, there'd be someone. Go look up Truth Unites on YouTube. I'll take one from here as you're thinking about other questions. Oh, actually, there's a refresh button. Okay. The Hebrews were told to plunder the Egyptians, but Abraham refused to plunder Sodom and Gomorrah, and Israel was told to devote the gold of Canaan to destruction. How do you know when to plunder and when to devote to destruction? Okay, this is a great question with a lot of attention to the Bible. So whoever this is talking about, so when Abraham in Genesis, he goes and actually defeats enemy kings and chooses not to take the plunder, but gives it to the other kings that were with him in the raid and defending the enemies. I assume that's what this person's thinking of. And then also talking about when Joshua enters into the promised land, into Canaan, he is told to devote the things to destruction, meaning absolutely destroy it. He isn't told to plunder it. This is a really helpful example to think about. As I mentioned briefly, not everything's worth plundering. Let me address the second example first. When the Israelites enter the promised land, they're told to devote the things to destruction. And God tells us why. He says it's because of the evil of the people of Canaan, right? So if we think about what might have been an object of gold in that culture, would be the idols to Baal, for example. And what God is commanding is to essentially carry out his justice against those peoples. And there's, so that's the reason I say some more about that if you want to follow up on that question. And I think so what's the application today? Can you plunder what sex traffickers are doing? No, absolutely not. Not everything can be plundered. And so there's actually, if you were to go read Augustine's book on teaching Christian doctrine, where he most lays out this analogy, he actually presents what I'd call a taxonomy. Like you have nature and you have human culture, okay? Everything God has made is good, right? So if you want to go make sense of what God has made, plunder away, right? Plunder away. Human culture is shot through with human sinfulness. So there's things in human culture that are so sinful that it's not worth plundering. The way Augustine says is there's the superstitious and the non-superstitious. There are things in human culture that are so superstitious, and he would actually say demonic, that we shouldn't even bother plundering it. We might need to learn about it in order to refute it, to reject it, to show it's evil, but it's not worth plundering. That's what I'd say to that question. Very good question. Maybe one or two more if you guys have any. I'm happy to talk in person afterwards. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and God bless as you continue in your time here at South Dakota State University. Happy to talk to you down there too.
For coming and tonight's Sages of Our Age lecture event. Pamphlets, books available on both tables. This is the Bethlehem one from Zach Howard's situation, and then that's also the Equip table as well. Free resources on both of them. Is that correct for yours? Excellent. So if you want to dig deeper on anything, related topics, unrelated topics, everything's there for free. You just have to read it. Reminder, if you'd like to know more or engage more on any of these subjects or just Christianity in general, please stick around, check out one of the sponsors. So Equip Campus Ministries, Navigators Crew, Zach, all resources here. If you have burning questions or burning need to talk about this stuff, don't suppress that. Take advantage of it right now. And then finally, thank you again for coming. And thank you, Dr. Howard. Would you please thank Dr. Howard with one more round of applause? You're done. Thank you all and have a good evening.